This story is based on true events. The names of characters and cities have been changed for confidentiality purposes. In a quiet suburb of Seoul, nestled among the tightly packed houses of a working-class neighborhood, lived the Kim family. From the outside, they were a picture of normality. The house, though modest, was well kept. The lawn was trimmed, and the front door was always locked, as if keeping the chaos within safely hidden from the world outside. A simple wooden sign adorned the front yard, with the family name painted in bold letters, Kim. But behind this facade of suburban tranquility, the Kim household was anything but peaceful. At the heart of the family was Mr. Kim, the father. He was a man of discipline, someone who commanded respect by sheer force of will. His presence was intimidating, not because of his physical stature, though he was tall enough to loom over most, but because of the silent authority he exuded. He worked long hours as a manager at a manufacturing plant, a job that required precision, control, and a certain coldness that seeped into every aspect of his life. To Mr. Kim, the world was a series of problems to be solved, a task that demanded focus and, above all, obedience. He had no patience for frivolity, and he believed that hard work was the only thing that could earn one's place in society. Love, affection, or warmth were notions he viewed as weaknesses. The family was expected to serve him and his expectations, not the other way around. Mrs. Kim, the mother, was a quiet figure, a woman whose presence was felt more in the background than in the foreground. She moved like a shadow, her every action serving the needs of her husband and children without complaint. She was a traditional woman, one whose role had been defined for her from an early age, and she took no issue with it. Her life had always been about sacrifice. She cooked the meals, cleaned the house, and raised the children. Her love for her family was as unwavering as it was muted. There were no grand gestures, no outbursts of affection, just a constant, steady pulse of routine. Mrs. Kim had long ago learned to suppress her own desires, turning herself into a servant of others' needs. She rarely spoke, especially to her youngest daughter, Giwan, whose neediness she found irritating. There were moments when Giwan's silence frustrated her, but she never voiced it. Instead, she resigned herself to the role of the dutiful wife and mother, maintaining a calm exterior even when her heart ached. Giwan, at 12 years old, was the youngest of the 10 children, a quiet girl who seemed to drift through life as though she were not entirely present. She was small for her age, her body slender and frail, a sharp contrast to the more robust figures of her older siblings. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with large dark eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her without ever truly reacting. Giwan had learned early on that silence was safer than words, and in her home words were rarely kind. She was not an overtly rebellious child, but she was a sensitive one, too sensitive for the brutal world she found herself in. She often felt like an outsider in her own family, as though her presence was an inconvenience to those around her. Her father was too harsh, her mother too distant, and her siblings, most of them older, too absorbed in their own lives to notice her. Her oldest brother, Jiho, was the embodiment of Mr. Kim's strict expectations. Jiho excelled in school and was a model student, always bringing home top grades and receiving praise from their father. To Jiho, Giwan was an afterthought. She was the youngest and thus, in his eyes, insignificant. He often dismissed her with a glance or a sharp word, too focused on his own ambitions to notice the subtle weight of loneliness in her eyes. His life was a straight path, focused, determined, and he believed that anything that strayed from that path, including Giwan, was to be ignored or scorned. Jiho's love for their father's approval made him distant and indifferent to his younger sister's suffering. Next was Jiwan's older sister, Sunmi. At 16, Sunmi was the family's only real source of rebellion. While Jiho followed in their father's footsteps, Sunmi sought to distance herself from the rigid structure of their home. She wore her defiance openly, often engaging in arguments with Mr. Kim over what she saw as outdated traditions. She would often disappear for days, leaving Giwan behind to face the emptiness of their parents' house. Sunmi wasn't cruel to Giwan, but she was too absorbed in her own world to offer her any comfort. Their interactions were brief and indifferent, as Sunmi had little patience for her younger sibling's quiet nature. The rest of the siblings, 6 in total, were scattered across various stages of life, but none of them paid much attention to Giwan. They were too caught up in their own dramas, school, work, relationships, to bother with the quiet youngest. Even when they were home, they often ignored her presence, as though she didn't truly exist within the family. Well, the noise of the older siblings, their laughter, their complaints, their arguments was constant, and Giwan learned early on to retreat into herself, to become invisible in a world that had no room for her. The house itself seemed to echo with the sounds of neglect. There were no family outings, no shared moments of joy, just a monotonous routine of meals and chores. Giwan found solace in her books, often retreating to her room, where she would curl up in silence, away from the prying eyes of her family. Her mind would wander, imagining a life beyond the confines of the house, a life where she was not invisible, where she could matter. But even in her solitude, there was no true escape. Mrs. Kim, though distant, would occasionally call her down for chores, tasks that were always given with a cold instruction. There was no tenderness, no smile, just the demand to help with dinner or clean the kitchen. Giwan would do it, of course, without question, but with a growing resentment. Every time she was given a task, every time her voice was ignored, it built up inside her, a storm that she could not express. Her only solace was the deep, dark silence that enveloped her at night. When she lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring into the dark, wondering if the world outside would ever notice her. The family's financial situation was strained, and though Mr. Kim worked hard, there never seemed to be enough money. The bills piled up, and the atmosphere at home grew more tense with each passing month. There was no room for indulgence or softness. The family's world was about survival, nothing more, nothing less. The walls of the house seemed to close in tighter as the pressure mounted, and Giwan could feel it pressing against her chest, a weight she couldn't escape. The Kim family, to the outside world, was simply another anonymous family in a sea of similar lives. But within the walls of their home, each day was a slow, unrelenting grind. For Giwan, it was a suffocating existence, one in which she felt like a ghost, moving through the motions without ever truly being seen. The weight of her family's expectations, the harshness of her father's discipline, the coldness of her mother's love, and the indifference of her siblings all built up, layer by layer, until one day the pressure would prove too much. Giwan's descent into silence was not a sudden or dramatic fall, but a gradual, almost imperceptible shift. It began in her earliest childhood, as she tried to make sense of the world around her, a world that had never quite made sense to her. Her parents, though present in the house, had never been fully present in her life. From the very start, she had been invisible to them, a mere shadow drifting in and out of their awareness. There had been no tenderness in their gestures, no warmth in their words. No matter how hard she tried, how much she longed for affection, it always slipped through her fingers, leaving her with nothing but the cold silence of neglect. Her earliest memories were filled with a profound sense of isolation. Even as a young child, she understood that she was different from her siblings, not in the way they looked or acted, but in the way she felt. They were all louder, more confident, more visible. They spoke their minds, expressed their desires, and fought for attention, while Giwan was simply quiet, retreating further into herself, as if each day spent in her family's presence chipped away at her ability to speak. As her siblings grew older and more self-absorbed, Giwan was left behind, quietly watching them from the periphery of their lives. They didn't hate her, but they certainly didn't love her either. She was, to them, a nuisance, something to be dealt with when necessary, ignored when not. Her brother Jiho, the eldest, was the most distant. He was always so focused on his studies, on meeting their father's expectations, that Giwan barely existed in his world. He would pat her on the head occasionally, but his eyes were always somewhere else, his thoughts consumed by the relentless drive to succeed. Jiho wasn't cruel. He didn't mock her or bully her, but he was indifferent, and to Giwan, that indifference felt more cutting than any harsh word could. It was the way he would pass her in the hall without a glance, the way he never even registered her presence as at the dinner table. He lived his life in a bubble of academic achievement and parental approval, and, with all her quiet longing, was nothing more. Sunmi, her older sister, was a different story. She was loud, rebellious, a force of nature who demanded attention. Sunmi's life was filled with constant arguments with their parents, particularly their father. She would storm off, slamming doors, hurling insults at the world that had tried to box her in. But Sunmi's rebellion never extended to Giwan. It wasn't out of kindness. It was simply because Sunmi had no interest in her younger sister. Giwan, to her, was like a piece of furniture in the background, always there but never worth noticing. There were moments, fleeting ones, when Giwan thought Sunmi might see her, when she would catch her older sister staring at her with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. But those moments were rare, and they never lasted long enough to make a difference. For Giwan, the loneliness of her childhood wasn't just an absence of affection, it was an absence of recognition. No one seemed to notice her in the way they noticed others. She wasn't the smart one like Ji-ho or the rebellious one like Sunmi. She wasn't the loud one or the pretty one or the one who could play the piano or sing. She was just there, a shadow among shadows, never fully seen or fully acknowledged. Her mind began to close in on itself, and the more she retreated into silence, the more her family seemed to forget she existed. The house, once a place of security, began to feel like a prison, each room echoing with the sound of her own heartbeat, each wall closing in tighter with every passing day. By the time Giwan was 8, she had stopped trying to seek attention. There were no more calls for her mother when she felt sick, no more attempts to show her father the things she had learned at school. The more she tried to be noticed, the more invisible she became. She learned to keep her thoughts to herself, her dreams locked away in the quiet corners of her mind where no one could touch them. Her emotions were buried so deep that even she couldn't always access them. She became an expert at pretending to be fine, at pretending that nothing hurt, when in reality, the ache of being unnoticed was growing inside her, twisting and knotting until it was all consumed. School provided a brief respite, but only a brief one. At first, she thought that maybe here, among strangers, she could reinvent herself. But the children at school were just like her siblings, loud, boisterous, and impossible to keep up with. She tried to make friends, but each time she reached out, her attempts were met with confusion and sometimes even pity. Her classmates didn't know how to deal with someone so quiet, so withdrawn. They would smile at her out of politeness, but when they talked, it was as if she didn't exist. The quiet girl in the back of the room, always doing her work but never joining in, was an enigma they couldn't understand, and so they ignored her too, just like her family did. As the years went by, Jiwon's sense of isolation deepened. She stopped trying to make friends at school, stopped seeking approval from her parents. She stopped even trying to be noticed. She buried herself in books, in stories of faraway places where people were loved, where they were seen. But even in her fantasies, there was always a nagging feeling that something was missing, that no matter where she went, no one would ever truly see. The world outside her home seemed just as indifferent to her as the world inside it. She felt like a ghost, drifting from one place to the next, never quite existing in the way that others did. By the time she turned 12, Giwan had learned to live with her silence. She didn't cry anymore. There were no tears left to shed. Instead, she became numb, her emotions locked away behind a wall that she had built herself. The sadness, the anger, the longing, they were all buried so deep that she couldn't access them, even if she wanted to. She had become a quiet observer of her own life, watching it pass by without ever truly participating. The house was full of noise, full of arguments and laughter and the constant shuffle of daily life, but in the midst of it all, Giwan was utterly alone. Her father's heavy footsteps, her mother's soft sighs, her siblings' casual bickering, they were all just sounds now, background noise that she had long since tuned out. They were all wrapped up in their own lives, their own stories, and Giwan had become nothing more than an extra in their film. She was a shadow in her own house, a flicker in the corner of their vision, a memory they couldn't quite place. And as the days went by, She began to believe that maybe this was all she was meant to be, a ghost, drifting through life without purpose, without meaning, without a voice. In her silence, Giwan began to realize something dark, something that had been growing inside her for months, perhaps even years. She wasn't just invisible to her family. She was insignificant. And in the vast, endless void of insignificance, she could make herself seen again, if only for a moment. The evening had begun like any other, with the Kim family gathered around their worn dining table, the clink of chopsticks and plates echoing through the room. The air was heavy with the scent of rice and kimchi, the steam from the food swirling up into the dim light above the table. The routine was monotonous, the same as it had been for years. Mrs. Kim quietly served the food, her movements precise but detached, as though the act itself was an obligation she could not escape. Mr. Kim, as always, sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding, his gaze cold and unwavering as he surveyed the scene. The children were scattered around, some quietly eating, others engaged in muted conversation. Giwan sat at the far end, the youngest of them all, her plate barely touched, as her mind drifted. This was the moment when Giwan felt most invisible. The table was a microcosm of the life she had come to accept, a place where her silence was neither acknowledged nor questioned. The others spoke in fragmented sentences, each word slipping by her unnoticed. Even when they did glance in her direction, their eyes passed over her like she was nothing more than a piece of furniture in the room. She was used to this by now, the familiar feeling of being unseen, unheard, but tonight was different. Tonight, something in the air felt heavier, thicker, as if a storm were gathering, not in the sky, but in the very walls of the house. It began with a small thing, something so insignificant that Giwan almost didn't notice it at first. A comment from Jiho, her oldest brother, who had just returned home from a study session. He was tired, his voice sharp and impatient, but when he sat down to eat, he glanced at her plate and made a small offhand remark. It wasn't cruel, not exactly, but it was pointed enough. He said something about how Giwan always had so little appetite. His tone was not one of concern, but of indifference, as if her inability to eat properly was an inconvenience to him. It was a comment so typical of Jiho, wrapped in his detached concern for anyone who didn't fit into his neatly ordered world. He was always the model child, the one who succeeded without effort, the one who had learned early on how to earn their father's approval. And in that moment, Jiwan's stomach twisted with a mixture of anger and shame. Her family had always dismissed her needs, her struggles, her very existence. They never saw her as someone deserving of attention or care. The slight from Jiho wasn't an isolated incident. It was a part of the endless cascade of microaggressions she had endured for years. The fact that she wasn't like the others, that she wasn't as loud, as assertive, or as successful as they were, had never been something they understood. She was the quiet one, the overlooked one, and they acted as if she didn't matter. But it wasn't just Jiho's comment that set her off. The tension in that had been building for weeks, months even, under the surface of the household, began to rise in that moment. It was as though the thin layer of calm that had held everything together, the quiet, the apathy, the unspoken rules, which she never did. She had learned long ago to stay silent, to avoid conflict. She kept her head down, her eyes averted, focusing on her own meal as if she were not a part of this scene at all. Giwan had always known that her mother would not defend her, that she would not step in to shield her from the cruelty of her siblings or the harshness of their father. But it wasn't just Jiho's words. It was their father's cold, unwavering gaze that followed every conversation, every gesture, every movement. Mr. Kim, the patriarch, had long since stopped trying to be a father in any meaningful way. He was a man of few words, a man whose idea of love was rooted in discipline, in control, in expectations. And tonight, as Giwan picked at her food, trying to ignore the slight that still burned in her chest, she could feel her father's eyes on her, watching her every move with that same impassive expression. He had long ago stopped pretending to care for her in any real way. To him, Giwan was just another failure, another person who couldn't live up to the standards he had set for his family. She could feel the weight of his gaze pressing down on her, suffocating her. And for the first time, she couldn't suppress the anger that welled up inside her. Mr. Kim's voice broke the silence, as it often did when things became too much for him to ignore. His words were always firm, authoritative, but tonight they carried an edge, a sharpness that cut through the air. He addressed Giwan, not with the warmth of a father speaking to his child, but with the coldness of a man speaking to an inferior. He chastised her for not finishing her meal, for being too frail, too weak. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, but the words were as heavy as a slap. His tone was so dismissive, so condescending, that it felt like he was stripping away the last remnants of her dignity. Giwan's heart began to race, her pulse quickening as the familiar wave of humiliation washed over her. She could feel her cheeks flush with embarrassment, but there was no place to hide, no escape. Her father's voice continued, relentless and cold, accusing her of being lazy, of not pulling her weight. It wasn't the first time he had said such things to her, but tonight, for some reason, it struck a nerve deep within her. Maybe it was the accumulation of years of being ignored, of being pushed aside, of being treated as though she were invisible, or maybe it was the simple fact that, in that moment, the weight of her family's neglect felt unbearable, like a crushing force that pressed down on her chest and made it hard to breathe. She could feel the anger building inside her, a sharp, electric feeling that began to pulse in her veins. It wasn't just anger at her father or at Jiho or at her mother's silence. It was anger at the entire life she had been forced to live, a life where she had never been allowed to speak, to be heard, to matter. For a moment, she thought she might burst into tears, as she had so many times before. But this time was different. This time, something else rose within her, something darker, something colder. The tears didn't come. Instead, a quiet rage began to simmer inside her, like a storm gathering force in the distance. Giwan didn't understand what it was at first. All she knew was that she felt a surge of power, a surge of control, like she had finally found something in her that no one could take away. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles whitening as the anger swirled within her. And then, it happened. Her father's hand came down on her head, a sharp, quick gesture meant to reprimand her, to bring her back into line. The blow wasn't hard, but it was enough to shatter the fragile barrier of control she had left. In that instant, something inside her snapped. The anger, the resentment, the bitterness, all of it erupted in a single, violent flash. Without thinking, Giwan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her heart was pounding in her chest, her mind a blur of emotion and adrenaline. The room seemed to close in on her, the faces of her family blurring into indistinct shapes. She didn't hear the murmurs of surprise, the quick intakes of breath from her siblings. All she could feel was the surge of fury that had been building inside her for so long. Jiwan's hands trembled as she looked around the room, at the people who had made her feel invisible for so many years. They were all there, her family, watching her with a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Her father, who had never cared to understand her, stood frozen, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. Jiho's face was contorted in annoyance, but there was something else behind his expression. A flicker of fear, perhaps, or the realization that something had shifted, something was different. And in that moment, Giwan knew that she could not go on living like this anymore. The world she had known, the world that had always pushed her down and left her to suffer in silence, was no longer enough. She was done being invisible. She was done being ignored. In the cold, suffocating silence of that room, Giwan felt something stir inside her. The idea first emerged as a vague thought, something fleeting that brushed against her consciousness in a moment of anger. But over the course of several days, it began to solidify, to take root in the dark corners of Giwan's mind. It wasn't just the anger that fueled it, though that was certainly a part of it, but something deeper, something primal that stirred when she realized the full extent of her invisibility, her powerlessness. The idea crept in slowly, quietly, until it felt as though it was the only thought left in her mind. There was a way out. There was a way to make them all see her. Giwan didn't know exactly what it would look like at first, She didn't have a concrete plan, but she could feel the energy coiling inside her, ready to burst. It was a strange sensation, this feeling of power, this sense of control that had eluded her for so long. It was as if the very act of planning, of thinking through the steps, gave her a strength she had never known. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. She couldn't escape the house, she couldn't escape her family. Not by leaving, not by running away. There was only one way to escape the prison that had held her captive for so long. She started small at first, observing, watching. She began to notice the small routines, the ways her family moved through their lives without ever considering her presence. She studied them, not with curiosity, but with a cold, calculating attention. She paid close attention to the times they ate, the moments they were most distracted, the times when the house was still and quiet. These were the moments when they let their guard down. The more she observed, the more she understood how vulnerable they were, how each of them, in their own way, had become predictable, easy to control. They weren't the powerful figures they tried to present themselves as. They were weak, fragile, each one trapped in their own web of dysfunction, their own self-delusions. And Giwan could use it. Wasn't just the physical patterns she observed. She began to read the emotions between them, the unspoken tensions, the old wounds that had never healed. Her father's coldness, his indifference to her existence was nothing new, but she realized now that it was not only directed at her. He treated everyone with the same distance, the same harsh clinical expectations. His love was conditional, earned through performance, through achievements, through obedience. And as for her mother, Giwan saw the cracks in the facade, the exhausted resignation in her eyes, the silence that spoke volumes. Mrs. Kim had long since abandoned any hope of ever being understood, and she had stopped trying to protect Giwan from the cruelty of their father, from the coldness of her siblings. She was a ghost in the house, just like Giwan. And it made sense to her now. The realization that if Giwan were to be free, there was no one who would stop, no one who cared enough to even try. Her siblings were no better. Jiho, the eldest, so obsessed with his studies, was hardly ever present at home, always off in his own world, lost in his pursuit of perfection. His absence made him the easiest target, an afterthought in Jiwon's mind, someone who could be disposed of quickly. Sunmi, on the other hand, was more complicated. Her rebellious nature, her sharp tongue, her refusal to conform to their father's demands, all of Giwan understood that Sunmi would be the hardest to control, the hardest to predict. She was a fire that couldn't be snuffed out easily. But that didn't matter. In the end, Giwan knew that if she were to succeed, she would have to eliminate all the threats. And that included Sunmi. As the plan began to take shape in her mind, Jiwan's thoughts grew more methodical, more deliberate. She studied the kitchen, noting where the knives were kept, where the cleaning supplies were stored. It didn't take long for her to realize that she had access to everything she needed. She wasn't as small and powerless as they believed her to be. In fact, she had been biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike. The knives were her first weapon of choice, not because they were the most effective, but because they were the most accessible. She could move quietly through the house, using the tools that were already in place, already familiar. They would never suspect her. Giwan spent hours in her room, plotting. She drew diagrams in the margins of old notebooks, making notes on each family member's habits, their weaknesses. She mapped out the house in her mind, visualizing each space, each door, each corner. It became a game to her, a way to gain mastery over the chaos that had always surrounded her. The house, the family, everything she had once felt trapped by. It was almost exhilarating, this feeling of control. She began to feel like a chess player, moving pieces around the board, thinking 3 steps ahead, anticipating every move. But as the days passed and the plan took form, Giwan began to feel the weight of what she was contemplating. The anger that had once burned so brightly now smoldered, replaced by a cold calculation. This wasn't just about getting back at them for their cruelty. It wasn't just about making them see her, or about escaping the silence that had defined her life. No, this was something deeper, more permanent. This was about taking control of her destiny in the most irreversible way possible. It was about breaking free from the prison of her existence, even if that meant leaving everything, her family, her home, behind. It was an act of finality, a declaration of her power. Giwan couldn't allow herself to be sentimental about it. She couldn't afford to feel anything. She had to be detached, like a surgeon performing an operation. Cold, clinical, precise. Emotions had no place in this. She was past that now. The family that had abandoned her, that had used her silence as an excuse to ignore her pain, didn't deserve any compassion. They didn't deserve a second chance. The night before she intended to execute the plan, she took one last look at the family. They were all gathered in the living room as they often were, but there was an air of disarray. Sunmi was arguing with their father, her voice sharp and biting, while Jiho sat with his face buried in a textbook, trying to block out the chaos. Mrs. Kim sat in her usual chair, looking vacant, her eyes unfocused as she stared at the television, though she wasn't really watching. Jiwan's gaze swept over them all, cold and calculating. She saw the cracks in their facades, the vulnerability that they had worked so hard to hide. For the first time, she saw them for what they truly were. Flawed, broken people, all struggling to maintain control over a life that had long since slipped beyond their reach. Giwan knew she had to act fast, and she had to be ruthless. There could be no mistakes. The plan was already set in motion, the pieces already in place. All she needed to do now was wait for the right moment. The moment when the house would be at its most vulnerable, when she could carry out the final steps without interference. It would happen soon. It had to. For the first time in her life, Giwan felt as if she was in control, as if the world had finally bent to her will. She no longer feared them. They were the ones who should fear her. The stillness of the house after the event was suffocating, like a thick fog that had settled over every room, every corner, every shadow. It was a silence so deep that it pressed against Jiwan's ears, enveloping her in its oppressive weight. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the surreal nature of what she had just done. The power she had taken, the control she had seized, was both intoxicating and hollow. She could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the distant sound of a clock ticking somewhere in the house. Everything felt impossibly still, as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving only this one frozen moment. The bodies lay scattered throughout the house, each one an unrecognizable figure of what had once been a person, now just lifeless remnants of a family she had severed herself from. The work had been methodical, precise, as planned. Giwan had never hesitated, not once. She had moved with a clarity and efficiency, as if each action was the next step in a series of motions she had practiced in her mind for weeks. The blood on the floor, on the walls, was a stark contrast to the sterile, antiseptic quiet that had followed. It didn't seem real, not at first. It was as though she had stepped into someone else's nightmare, and she was only watching it unfold from the outside. Giwan stood at the center of the house, her feet planted on the floor where the others had once walked, her breath shallow. The darkness had settled in with the evening, though it seemed to weigh even heavier now, thick with the smell of blood and the metallic tang of death that seemed to hang in the air. The air felt wrong. It felt like it was soaked with something viscous that clung to her skin and to her thoughts. The weight of what she had done pressed down on her chest, but not with the guilt she had expected. No, it was something different, something more complex. There was a certain emptiness, a hollow satisfaction, but also a creeping sense of disbelief. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. It wasn't supposed to feel so detached, as though she were watching from a distance, like a spectator at a play. She moved through the house in a daze, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old wood underfoot. Her eyes scanned the rooms, the familiar rooms that had once been the backdrop of her life, but now seemed foreign, strange. The walls that had once held her as a child now seemed to close in on her, as if they were suffocating her with their own history. She moved past her mother's room, the door ajar, the faint scent of perfume still lingering in the air. It was strange. how she could still smell traces of her, even though she was gone. Mrs. Kim had always been a presence in the house, but never truly a part of it. She had always been so distant, so removed. But now, her absence felt like an entire chapter of Giwan's life had been erased. There was a sense of finality to it all, as though the very fabric of her existence had been torn apart and remade in a way that couldn't be undone. The house, once filled with noise and conflict, was now silent. The family that had once been her tormentors, her constant source of pain and neglect, was gone. There was no more shouting, no more cold glares, no more disappointment from her father. It was a strange sort of peace, the kind that comes only after everything has been destroyed. Giwan stood in the hallway, her eyes blank, her mind still processing what had transpired. She had expected something else, an overwhelming surge of relief, perhaps, or a wave of guilt, but there was only this numbness, this cold, unfeeling void. Her gaze moved to the staircase, and for a moment she thought she saw a flicker of movement, a shadow in the corner of her eye. But when she turned her head, there was nothing there. The house was still. No one was left to speak, to scream, to argue. The finality of it all hung in the air like a thick fog, suffocating and impenetrable. The hours passed slowly, stretching out like endless hollow moments. Giwan didn't know how long she had been wandering through the house, lost in a haze. She couldn't bring herself to touch anything, to clean anything up, to even acknowledge what had happened. She simply existed in this strange new world, a world where her family was gone, where the person she had once been no longer existed. She walked past the kitchen again, her eyes lingering on the knife drawer, the tools she had used, the bloodstains still marking the handles. It felt so unreal, so distant, as though she had been in some sort of trance, a dreamlike state. And now she was waking up to the aftermath of her actions. But the reality was there. The blood was still there, the stains still fresh. Her family was dead, and it was her doing. It was she who had ended it all, and there was no going back. For the first time, she understood what it meant to take a life. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't empowering, it wasn't anything like the way the movies or books portrayed it. It was just nothing. She was left with nothing but the aftermath, the quiet, the emptiness, the endless void that stretched out before her. The night passed, and Giwan didn't sleep. She couldn't. The darkness outside her window was mirrored by the darkness inside her, a cold, unfeeling absence that gnawed at her insides. She didn't want to think about the future, about what came next. What did she do now? What was the point of anything, now that everything had changed? She didn't know. The weight of her actions, the scope of what she had done, was too much for her to comprehend fully. She had killed them, all of them, and she didn't know if she was capable of feeling anything about it. The morning came, but it didn't feel like morning. It didn't feel like anything at all. The sun crept slowly across the sky, casting long, unnatural shadows across the empty rooms of the house. Giwan stood at the window, staring out at the quiet street, but her mind was far away, drifting in a sea of confusion. She didn't know what to do now. She didn't know what to say, or how to even begin to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. "Clean up your boss," he said calmly. "When can you even begin to comprehend the enormity of what had happened?" The house, once filled with life, was now a tomb. A hollow shell where everything she had ever known had been ripped away in an instant. There was a part of her that wanted to run, to leave, to disappear into the world outside, but she didn't. She couldn't. The thought of leaving the house, of walking out into a world that no longer made sense to her, was too overwhelming. The walls, the rooms, the space, they were all that was left. The family was gone, but this house that had been both a prison and a refuge, was still here. The sky was a golden blue. It was the only thing that remained constant, the only thing that hadn't abandoned her. As the days wore on, Giwan began to feel the weight of the consequences. She knew what would happen. The police would come. The neighbors would ask questions. The world would start looking for answers, for someone to blame. She knew she couldn't hide from it forever. But in that moment, In the stillness of the house, she didn't care. The world outside no longer seemed to matter. The silence that spoke louder than anything else, louder than any words could ever do. The silence of the aftermath.